In 2024, Intel is looking like a completely different company. Intel is barely ranking in the top 10 CPUs sold on Amazon. You see here, it is all AMD right now, except for this number 8 spot is the 14900K. Intel's employees have even said their own products are not worth buying over AMD.
Actual Intel employee who actually worked on servers. Even he is recommending to both companies and individual consumers to buy AMD, even as an Intel employee.
And now Intel is admitting in their very own marketing that their CPUs are falling short. It's at this point where Intel is at an all-time low. You see, Intel just launched an entirely new revolutionary generation of CPUs called Arrow Lake. You can generally judge how many people are interested in a product based on videos that are made about the product. And this isn't anything about the creators of the videos, like they made great videos, they did great in-depth testing, but the interest, the desire to want to watch or keep up with Intel from the audience and people actually buying CPUs is just at an all-time low. Plus, with this generation of CPUs, for some reason they dropped the Core i branding. Intel's iconic branding for their CPUs. It's like, we don't need that anymore. We're gonna call it Core Ultra 200, whatever the heck this is. What happened to 15th gen? Intel, what happened to it? We wanna know. What's even more crazy is, Intel used to fabricate their own CPUs. Well, with this newest generation, they caved. They work with TSMC to make these CPUs. Now, TSMC makes everybody else's chips too. NVIDIA, AMD, even Apple's chips are made at TSMC. So TSMC is just kind of big boying Intel at the moment. Also, the performance for these CPUs is not that much better. Like overall performance is a little bit better than the last generation. These CPUs are regressive in gaming compared to the last generation of their old ones, and AMD was already technically winning in gaming up to this point anyways. Reviewers are struggling to say anything good about their newest generation of CPUs.
There really are not many good cases you could make for it. In Intel's prior generation parts, again, even considering all the efficiency stuff, the cost argument is just not there for the Ultra 200 series right now.
Intel also may have caused the largest failure in silicon chip history with the degradation of every single 13th and 14th gen CPU. Intel pushed their power too much, and now this is happening. The situation with these CPUs may be fixed now, but we don't really know for sure, and the trust of anyone buying or spending a good amount of money on a new CPU is kind of lost. Now it's getting hard to even recommend an Intel CPU in general.
As it stands, we can't and don't recommend anyone purchase an Intel 13th or 14th gen processor.
Then you also may have known that Intel started making graphics cards as of, what was that year, 2022? And Intel's Arc graphics cards, they exist, but check out the market share, and I don't think they're looking all that good right now. I'm rooting for them because I would love some competition in the graphics card space, but it is not really looking that good yet. And that probably explains why Intel's valuation as a company is kind of tanking right now. This is over the past 5 years, and you can see that they're down almost 60%. Intel is on this downward spin at the moment. And companies like Samsung and Apple are reportedly looking to acquire Intel. This is just wild. How are we in this situation? This is like a different reality or different universe at this point. That doesn't mean that this is going to happen. It's just wild that it could. So I just listed a bunch of problems with Intel as a company, but this is only a small list of all the issues that Intel is having. How does a company who basically invented computers as we know them today, how do they fall from grace this much? And is it even possible for Intel to recover? Let's talk about that. Because we don't want one company like AMD or NVIDIA, I talked about graphics cards a little bit ago, we don't want these companies dominating the space. We don't want a company like TSMC making every single chip for every single company. Intel can compete on fabrication and foundries against TSMC. So Intel being here is a big player. I don't really have an attachment to any of these companies. Actually, for Intel, I haven't even used an Intel CPU since, 2016 2016 or something like that. 2018 is the last time I used an Intel CPU. I recently made a video where I did switch to Intel and I did experience all the problems, like, oh, this is why people aren't buying Intel CPUs anymore. I made a whole video about my experience on Intel, and now my main system is on an Intel CPU, and I'm testing it long term to see how it really does hold up. Now, for this video, I'm not really going to be focusing on any of the extra markets and stuff. Like, Intel made a huge failure by not capitalizing on the mobile market and being a huge player there. Also, Intel could have invested in graphics cards way back in the day and could have been a major player in that space. But Intel didn't do that. And we're not going to really harp on about that because that's in the past. That was just a decision that they could have made. So what we're really going to talk about is how is Intel where they are now and what can they do about this. And I know many of you guys are going to say, oh, Intel's in this situation right now because of the current leadership. And I'm here to tell you that I don't think that is true. Pat Gelsinger is the current CEO of Intel, and he might have a slight cause of why Intel is in this situation, but Pat Gelsinger only came into the company in 2021, and Intel's problems really have been brewing for a lot longer. In fact, Pat actually says that the previous leadership in Intel was not investing in the right things, and his plan is to turn this around over time, a complete restructuring of Intel as a company. So we will see how Pat's leadership ends up going into the future, and we will talk about what the path is that Intel is on. So a man by the name of Paul Otini, by the way, rest in peace to this guy. He did pass away in 2017. Rest in peace, dude. Paul came into Intel as a CEO in 2005, okay? Paul also seems to have retired, at least from what I can tell, in 2012. He seemed to have done this because of health complications, and he couldn't really work as a CEO anymore. As you know, a CEO is actually a very stressful job. You may make a lot of money, and you may be swimming in cash, but it is a very, very stressful job. Guy was a little bit of a departure from what normally Intel would hire as a CEO, and it's because he was actually a manager of sales and marketing. He was a marketing guy. He wasn't an engineer, which usually CEOs of Intel were engineers of the company that understood the products really well. Pat Gelsinger is an engineer as well. And in the mid 2000s, when this guy is CEO of Intel, Intel was kind of thriving. That's when the core branding of CPUs started, introducing multi-core CPUs to a huge population. He is apparently responsible for making a deal with Apple to get Intel chips into their computers. Obviously now Apple uses their own silicon, which is probably one of the reasons why they don't make as many CPU sales nowadays. Intel doesn't. Now, Paul was also responsible for some really weird stuff because in the mid 2000s, surprisingly, AMD was really competitive with Intel at the time. But this guy as CEO was responsible for bribing other companies to not work with AMD. Really scummy. Probably stuff like this still happens today. I think Nvidia has some problems with this, with their partners. He is marketing. He isn't as much on the product side. And in this time, I don't really think Intel really made a ton of innovation. He was really working on connections with other companies and making deals with them instead of innovating on their products. And that seems to kind of be also what what is up with their names? I don't know how to say their names. But this guy is kind of the definition of being lost in the plot, lost in the sauce. He kind of lost the vision. This guy was a process engineer for a fabrication plant in Chandler, Arizona. His leadership in Intel was very, very weird. So in 2015, he announced Intel's $300 million diversity and technology initiative to support the company's goal to achieve full representation of women and underrepresented minorities in Intel's US workforce by 2020. It's not like diversity is a bad thing for a company. I want to make that clear. Obviously, having more people from different cultures and with different beliefs is a good thing to have in the workplace. But at the same time, Intel is a chip company. Intel isn't a company that is like a social company. I think he just got lost in the plot. He did this many times. This guy, he got very involved into social politics and everything. You can see here in 2017, sorry, everything highlighted. In 2017, Krizane, I don't know how to say his name, spoke out against executive order banning entry into the country of residents of 7 predominantly Muslim nations. He's getting involved into politics and social politics and identity politics and stuff. And it's like, it's not, Intel makes CPUs and like network chips and stuff. Like, I don't get it. Not only was he not focusing on the Intel chips for the company itself, making innovation in the chips, he didn't really bring any innovation to the company, but also this guy exercised stock options and sold shares of Intel worth $24 million after the company had learned that its sold chips in the last decade had a major security vulnerability. So basically, this guy was waiting to sell his shares in the company until this random security breach happened, or flaw in their systems happened, and then he sold right before that. Isn't that so weird how he just I'm just going to make all this money. I'm just going to get my bag and go, And that doesn't seem like it's in the best interest of Intel as a company as a whole. Instead, he's looking out for himself. CEO of a company, you should have the best interest of the company at heart. Also, during this era, you guys might know that Intel stagnated extremely hard. Back in 2016, I'm pretty sure it was 2016, Intel Skylake was introduced, which is Intel's sixth gen CPUs, 6000 series CPUs. And these CPUs, they were pretty good for the time. But the problem is, this guy, under his leadership, actually stifled the innovation of Intel's process nodes. So Intel was stuck. And what we saw into the future is that every single CPU generation after Skylake for quite a long time, and honestly until 2021, until Alder Lake or their 12th gen CPUs were introduced, a whole 6 generations. It says here that because of Krasniq's decisions, however you say his name, Intel also struggled to produce 10 nanometer chips compared to chip manufacturers like TSMC and Samsung. And we can look farther into this. TSMC and Samsung were able to bring out their chips about a year or two earlier than Intel was able to get their 10 nanometer process down. And that meant that there was pretty much a cap of how efficient that these CPUs could possibly get. Intel could keep innovating on it to refine the process over time on 14 nanometer, but 10 nanometer, no matter what, you're going to be able to fit more transistors onto the processor. It's going to be more efficient, more powerful, and cheaper. And Intel, under this guy's leadership, was not able to get this out the door. So AMD really capitalized on this situation where Intel was stuck not really being able to push past innovation, and AMD, because they worked with TSMC, were able to, break past it, as well as they had a very promising architecture, as we still see to this day. So this guy, it didn't seem like he had a very good leadership. Not only did he make Intel stagnate more, but he also seemed to have lost the plot. If you want to put more to it, okay, if this didn't convince you that he was a bad leader, you know how he actually got kicked out of Intel. He got kicked out. He didn't really leave, or he was forced out, really. In June 2018, an investigation was launched against Krasniq after an employee at Intel received a tip of him being engaged in a consensual relationship with whatever. Basically, he had a relationship with an employee. I don't know the entire history of Intel as a company, but in their recent history, this guy sucks. Intel didn't expect this guy really to have to get kicked out so soon. And this left a power vacuum in Intel where they didn't have another CEO lined up. And basically, this guy came into place for him. I don't have that much to say about Bob Swan. Served as Intel's CEO from 2018 to 2021. He had to pick up the pieces and just kind of have the company survive. In 2019, he was appointed the permanent CEO of Intel. He had reportedly told employees that he was not pursuing being a CEO of Intel. He didn't even want to be CEO, but he was forced into the role. This just leaves Intel in more and more of a mess. And you can probably see this in the time. A lot of the time that Bob Swan was CEO of the company, Intel's products were just basically rehashed versions of the same thing again, as Intel was trying to get past his manufacturing process and really trying to innovate. Eventually they did push out 12th gen, and that kind of brings us to the current CEO of Intel, or at least the current leadership position. Because in 2021, Intel announced that Bob Swan would step down as CEO and be replaced by VMware CEO Pat Gelsinger. Pat Gelsinger also worked for Intel for a very long period of time, but at the time, he was CEO of a different company, VMware. Intel stock rose 7% after this announcement. Yes, 10 to 15 years ago, Intel was on top of the game, but that's because of their history. they weren't really innovating that much behind the scenes. These CPUs look very similar to how they did 10 to 15 years ago. Intel as a company, they stagnated on their fabrication process for so many years based on decisions that were made internally in the company, and that made them slow down, and they also allowed their competition AMD to completely catch up in this time. And now Pat Gelsinger is coming in at 2021, and he has to kind of pick up the pieces again. And it almost makes me feel bad for this multi-millionaire CEO. He's obviously making a lot of money because he's got to put in the work. This guy is really good on one-on-one interviews, and the way that he talks about things, the way that he's pushing the company to really push into fabrication and everything. I think he is probably the first glimmer of hope that Intel has had in many, many years. Intel's biggest problem right now, at least to me as someone who doesn't have like a ton of insider info or anything like that, I don't know anybody who's really involved in this. Intel's biggest problem is cash, capital, all that kind of stuff. This is a company that doesn't have the amount of money they need to invest in things into their future. Intel has done tons of layoffs as of lately to just try to cut back on their expenses. They've put so much money into their fabrication, making these foundries for other companies so that they can manufacture their chips into the future, which is a really good long-term play if Intel can get business on these foundries. I think that is one of their biggest things because Intel is getting a lot of funding for the government to build these foundries. Hopefully long-term it'll pay off. Especially a thing about these foundries is these ones are built in the United States. Like even my home state of Ohio, Ohio, what's going on in Ohio? I got to visit Ohio. There's one going into Arizona. They're upgrading the one in New Mexico. There's one in Oregon that's being built. There's all kinds of foundries across the United States that Intel is building. And these have a huge advantage. This is where the political side of Intel actually matters because depending who wins the election in the United States, there may be tariffs. And if other companies that are also US based companies like Nvidia, AMD, I'm pretty sure AMD's based here, Qualcomm, also based in the United States, tons of chip companies, having foundries built in the United States can keep the cost down quite a bit. And that might matter for the long term, especially because foundries take a long time to build. Their foundry business seems promising. Pat Gelsinger is very all in on the foundry business.
This is an exciting day for America. It's an exciting day for the CHIPS program.
On their CPU side, Intel's CPUs, especially on the desktop side of CPUs, I don't think that Intel will ever be the same titan that it was with their CPUs, where like 90% of people are buying Intel. And that's where it brings me to Arrow Lake. I don't think this is as big as a Zen moment because when AMD made Ryzen, those CPUs were revolutionary. And I bought an AMD Ryzen CPU like right off the bat because I just saw that potential there. Even though they've moved to a tile-based architecture, kind of like how AMD did with Ryzen, I don't think Intel's Arrow Lake is going to be that revolutionary CPU. The tiles on Intel CPUs do have potential though, because tiles, you combine different ones from different manufacturing processes. You can get better yields on them because it's not this giant full fat die. Even though it has some bugs at the start here, we're obviously seeing that.
And then it breaks. Time after time after time.
But I will say I have some inklings that it probably does have the performance to do quite a bit better, okay, or the potential to do quite a bit better than it is right now. Throughout Intel's history, they've always had this issue where their CPUs require higher clock speed and higher power to get any better performance out of them, unless they can, keep dropping the process node for the architecture. It just seems like Intel's architecture is pretty much fully matured at this point in time, and they just have to keep pushing clock speed to get more performance. Arrow Lake. It does seem like there is more overhead potential, and Dur Bauer shows this in his video about the new CPUs, that it's not just about the core clocks, but if you increase different clocks on the CPU, or if you mess with the voltage a little bit on it, then there is actually a lot of headroom for performance. So it seems like Arrow Lake and their tile-based architecture actually has a lot of headroom to improve into the future, kind of like how Ryzen did before for AMD. I'm not sure how much better the next generation will be, and if it could keep pace with AMD into the future, but it does have potential. I also wanted to say too is Intel gave up hyper-threading, which, kind of doubles your core count on your CPUs, really something that gave Intel CPUs a claim to fame for a long time until Ryzen kind of brought this to the mainstream as well. And it's impressive that they can get a similar or better amount of performance as their other CPUs without hyperthreading. They took away a feature. These CPUs aren't built on Intel's fabrication, which is kind of embarrassing for Intel. They have all this stuff and they're not using it. But I do think that Intel is building these new foundries right now that are actually going to be more advanced than TSMC is at the moment.
Well, what you see behind us here would be the sub 2 nanometers, or 18A as we call it. So 2 nodes more advanced than what they're using today.
And I honestly think that Intel only used TSMC this generation for their CPUs because their foundries aren't ready yet. Their next generation will probably be on a better process node than what TSMC can offer. This would also mean that since Intel would be making out their own fabrication, that Intel is going to make some more money, and they desperately need more money. Also, Intel's mobile chips are surprisingly really good now. Intel's finally fixed their power efficiency problems on mobile. I didn't think Intel would ever be able to do it. Pretty good in performance, a little bit behind the other ones, but for its power efficiency, it's so much better that it's worth using it. And then on the graphics card side of things, obviously Intel has introduced Intel Arc. This is probably their most questionable side of their business right now. Their CPUs are going in a good direction. Their foundry business is going in a good direction. Their graphics cards are Intel Arc cards. Intel's made huge improvements with them. They're way better than they were at launch. Their newest generation is probably going to be rumored to come out in Q1 of 2025, which is probably bad timing because that's when NVIDIA is going to release their new generation and AMD is going to release their new generation of graphics cards. So I don't think it's going to be the best time to release these. Intel, if they were to offer a graphics card at a very competitive price, and they took a hit to their margins, like I would just get it then. That'd just be clearly the best deal. The problem is with Intel's graphics cards is they need the extra capital in order to do this. But I don't think Intel has the capital to do it. Obviously, Intel is struggling for money at the moment. This is probably the most up in the air side for Intel. I'm probably gonna revisit Intel Arc, somewhat soon to see how it kind of holds up now. This is how Intel has ended up in their current situation, and if they do have hope. I think they do have hope. I wouldn't be investing in them, but I think they have potential. And I think Pat Gelsinger as a CEO, hearing this guy talk is a lot more inspiring than many other Intel CEOs have been. But that is just the CEO. Obviously, there's a huge company behind it and everything. It is crazy how much they've fallen from grace. And I think this is a wake-up call for Intel as a company. It just seems like years and years of stagnation, lack of innovation that has led to Intel to be in this position that they are now. And obviously, that isn't going to work out for them. That's been it for me. I'm going to take off. Hopefully you guys have a good video. That doesn't make sense. Hopefully you guys have a good day. And I'm going to see you guys in the next video. Rip Intel. Hopefully they can recover. All right, peace.